And to discuss what we saw last night and may see today, CBS News business analyst Jill Schlesinger and Yahoo Finance columnist Rick Newman, who've been following, of course, the latest. And again, this remains a very fluid situation, but if last night appeared to be catastrophic when the futures dipped past the 840 mark, it does not seem to see catastrophe, at least on the menu today. What do you make of what we saw last night and really now what we're seeing today?
Well, I think any of the C words, catastrophe, crash, we can kind of push aside for the time being. That's good news. You're right. When we saw the futures down that 800 points or so, we know that futures can only move by a maximum of 5% in that overnight session before they stop trading. We didn't get there. But what's really instructive is to see how the markets started to kind of narrow those losses. And it may have been just this feeling of, hey, wait a second, we don't know what's going to happen next. And it may be a little bit of, oh, we got short, we covered our shorts, we need to get back in. And finally, it could also be that maybe, just maybe, after that somewhat more conciliatory speech from Mr. Trump, that people are feeling a little bit less nervous about what the future holds, maybe erroneously, by the way.
How much was Brexit a test run for this moment in the U.S.?
It was obviously a test run. We didn't think it was going to be. I mean, the media established didn't. But I would say this is more like 5 or 10 Brexits. I mean, this affects the whole U.S. economy. It affects the Federal Reserve, which is the most important financial institution in the world. It affects the world's biggest stock market. It affects policies directly impacting the companies in the world's biggest stock market. So I'm surprised by the snapback we're seeing this morning, and I'm not really expecting it to last. And I think the big question, we know what Trump has outlined a general plan without a lot of details. So the big question is he going to try to do everything he said he wants to do? And if he does, that is bad news for markets. However, if he
specifically what? I mean, what's the market as much as it hates uncertainty?
I'll list them for you.
What specifics do they not
I'll list them for you. Pull out of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Get tough with China on trade to the extent of imposing tariffs on China. Deporting every undocumented worker in the United States is bad for the economy because it's going to disrupt the labor force. And finally, if he meddles with the Federal Reserve, he will be doing what he criticized President Obama for doing, which is politicizing the Fed.
And I would just add one more concern to that, and that is if you look at his tax policy, it would add trillions of dollars to the national debt. And so while there may be a little bit of a cookie in there for everyone, I think that investors are a little bit concerned that that would weigh on the U.S. economy and not good in the long run.
Right.
What about I think, general consensus, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is basically dead in the water at this point?
I mean, I would have to think yes, because when you run with such fortitude on this is a terrible deal, and by the way, it's almost like you had both sides saying we don't like TPP. What's interesting, though, is with the House, the makeup of the House and the Senate, those folks actually were much more in favor of TPP. I think it's very hard to move against the electorate on each side of the aisle on that one, and I think that's a terrible blow to President Obama's legacy, one of the potential terrible blows.
In fact, the whole government basically that we have now favors TPP. I mean, President Obama fought for it, and there was at one point general support for it in the House and the Senate, but you're right, it would be going against the will of the voters at this point.
If we saw consecutive losses as the polls tightened here in the last couple of weeks, were there signs, though, if the media missed, if the pollsters missed, was the market telling us something perhaps that we didn't appreciate?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
I mean, the polls got it wrong. The market, the prediction sites were predicting an even greater odds of a Clinton victory than a lot of the polls. So they also might have been sort of following the polls. But no, markets got this wrong, too.
And I would also say that, I'm sure Rick got this also, we would get these blasts from each of the big investment houses, like what we expect in the election. And no one was prepared for this. Nobody. So the reality is that everyone seemed to get it wrong. But you know what? Cooler heads are prevailing right this minute, which is actually not a bad thing either if you're an individual investor.
When it comes to a Treasury Secretary or a Fed chair, do we have any sense of who those people might be?
I I think that there have been names that are floated in terms of Treasury Secretary. I'm sure you heard this at Larry Kudlow formerly of CNBC.
Larry Kudlow or Steve Mnuchin, who has been is a former Goldman Sachs banker who has been the chief fundraiser for Trump. And Janet Yellen stays in place. I mean, she has a 4-year term, which runs out in 2019, I think.
Although Donald Trump has made her a focus of his campaign.
Yeah, and what's interesting here also is that we are just at the precipice of something really interesting happening with the Federal Reserve, another interest rate increase in December. I don't think this necessarily derails it unless we see a wipeout in markets and a global cascading situation over the next few weeks. The Fed is still on track to raise rates again. And by the way, looking into next year, we continue to expect some small incremental progress in the economy. We saw some good numbers on wages. We've seen decent information about
earnings
overall
are coming
growth.
back.
Earnings are coming back. And so the Fed kind of has a clear path to raise rates. What a fascinating time to be a Federal Reserve banker and say, oh, my God, this guy hates us and we're trying to normalize policy. There
are tens of millions of voters, however, who I think do not feel as rosy about the economy, perhaps.
True enough. True enough. But you know what's interesting about that? We got an interesting statistic yesterday from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's an esoteric report, the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey, okay? This says how many job openings are there. There's a bunch of, over 5 million jobs that are out there unfilled. We also found out that a bunch of Americans quit their jobs voluntarily, 12% more than last year. You don't quit your job unless you think you can get a better job. I think that's another sign that the labor market is improving.
Well, we certainly have not seen the catastrophe that was portended, if nothing else, just a few hours ago. Jill Schlesinger, Rick Newman, we do very much appreciate the insights today.
Thanks.